Hello, everyone. Welcome to Module 2. We are going to go over American education between the time period of 1865 and 1915. Um, we are Manjushri Sarda, Abigail Johnson, and Jacoby Padilla, and we will be presenting for you today. So, our biggest question today overall is how did educational reforms from this time period help create the modern American school system? Um, and our learning targets are explaining major educational, wait, I just said that. Yeah, so that target, and then how to describe the modern American school, how it developed from this time and how it affects today. You'll be able to compare the key ideas of educational leaders and analyze how immigration and segregation influenced education as well. So I'll pass it on to Jacoby.
Okay. So within the American education system, there was a significant push to use federal and state power to increase conformity among states with how their schools functioned. The creation of the Federal Education Agency initiated this movement. The agency had the power to enforce educational provisions, including resources, services, and pretty much anything relating to education. There was a large effort to reform states, mostly in the South, and it was believed that these states had inadequate education systems. The agency compared data between these states and then states with whom they believed had adequate educational systems. Pretty soon, the agency lost department status due to citizens, politicians, and the agency itself just not being ready for direct federal oversight. It was soon changed into just an office to gather data.
Just tell
Next
me
slide.
next. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Moving into the post-war era, we begin to see widespread compulsory attendance laws. In the 1890s, states began to hire truancy officers whose job it was to prosecute parents whose children were not in school. Many parents and families found this too intrusive, which led to a lot of lawsuits. The Republican Party feared the increasing number of immigrants, whom they referred to as ignorant masses, which explains their push for compulsory attendance laws. The Democratic Party at first opposed these laws. Schools were crowded, and many teachers opposed forcing students to attend. Because of the 10th Amendment delegates any power not given to the federal government to the state, these laws fell into the hands of the state. And by 1890, 27 states had these compulsory attendance laws. By 1918, that number increased to 48. As more students are required to attend school, of course, enrollment increases. This increase is mostly due to population growth, immigration, and in the increase of industrialization at the current time period. More families also began to move to urban areas for work, and soon schools fell behind and faced a lot of management problems. Next. Okay, so looking into building the modern school system, just for context, in 1870, our American school system contained about 7.5 million students. 70 years later, that number increased to 26 million students. Parallel to student enrollment increases, the actual school year became longer. It went from 132 days in 1870 to 175 days in 1940. Strangely, though, rural schools only followed this increase while urban schools actually reduced or shortened their school year. We also observe more students beginning to graduate as well. In 1870, the number of students graduating high school was only about 2%. And by the mid 19th century, that number shot up to over 50%. Before I mentioned that federal educational oversight failed, But even if it didn't fail, it wouldn't have been that necessary. Schools around the nation just naturally became similar due to one another, due to those leading them. They possessed a shared culture of values and knowledge. Next. Okay, we then begin to see an implementation of the one best system. Historian David Tyack describes how schools tried to create a catch-all or blanket system in order to serve all, everywhere, and all the time. This is where we begin to see age grading introduced. Schools moved from the common schoolhouse containing one classroom or multiple with different age ranges to classrooms where students were placed based on their age and ability. The classes also began to examine specific subjects. They began to have a schedule or a sequential method of learning material and example activities. Basically, this sounds a lot like the beginning of curriculum. This type of classroom functionality brought about exams, which provided teachers and students with feedback and a record of content. They created competition paired with classroom values of obedience and punctuality. The way that teachers ran their classroom mirrored the characteristics of the common industrial factories. Next. So, as more high schools started being built, co-education became universal. It made more sense economically having one school as opposed to two separate schools. Unfortunately, families also feared that separate schools would create homosexuality. Students started leaving academies for high schools because they ran better and they also had better facilities due to public funding. High school was seen as a way to obtain middle class status. Poor white students ended up just as successful as wealthy students who attended high school, following a creation of upward mobility. Poor students shared the aspirations and manners of the middle class. Interestingly enough, this followed in New England, but it was less common in cities like Boston, bigger cities. Workplace discrimination, including racial, academic, and socioeconomic discrimination, occurred. White employers refused to hire people of color. Although high schools created this upward mobility, students from poor urban families rarely attended school. Fortunately, at the time, dropping out of school didn't interfere too significantly with finding jobs or employment in the 19th century, but moving into the 20th century, it became a requirement for colleges and jobs. Next. By the mid 1900s, high school became a common experience for white American students. This expansion of high schools was due to three main forces: parent demand for more education, the economic climate requiring more skilled workers, and government support. Importantly, this expansion was not supported by everyone. There were actually 9 court cases challenging the legality of free public education. Taxpayers opposed the usage of public funds, and many people wanted the common school. Rural communities strongly supported high schools, though, because they represented an economic opportunity and social mobility. High school students who graduated generally earned more money than those who did not. And these families saw high school as an investment. High schools created local pride and an identity, reinforcing shared cultural values. In 1900, many teenagers worked instead of attending school, about 35% of girls and about 70% of boys. By 1950, these numbers dropped to 25% for girls and only 40% for boys. Next. As high schools became more common, education systems began to share many similarities. Reformers started to criticize professionally managed urban schools and locally controlled rural schools. They recommended schools be combined. having the larger urban schools absorb the smaller schools. They encouraged professional oversight and stronger administrative systems. President Theodore Roosevelt soon implemented the Country Life Commission, which built up rural communities just like the cities. These consolidated schools had many benefits, including better trained teachers, libraries, science labs, and athletic facilities. They did have their concerns, though, as they came with less local control, a decrease in community tradition, and a lot more government regulation. Schools needed to follow calendars, academic curriculum, and teacher qualification requirements. Next. There were also many changes in the development of kindergarten. The word kindergarten can be directly translated to children's garden in German, which is reflective of Friedrich Froebel's emphasis on play and activity. He created Froebel gifts, which are essentially manipulatives. His idea emphasized creativity, hands-on learning, and natural curiosity. The Prussian government soon condemned his kindergarten as they believed it to be destructive to religious and political authority. Soon after, a disciple of Froebel, Margaret Schurz, established the first U.S. kindergarten. Kindergarten was initially popular among wealthy families, but it soon became associated with helping poor urban children with improving their behavior, supporting their families, and introducing middle class values. Kindergarten was so successful in the United States because it could be easily integrated into existing schools. It was greatly supported by parents and it didn't interfere with the older grades. Next. Similar to the kindergarten, we begin to see the development of the university, which was different from college. Older colleges focused on classical studies and a liberal arts education. Older colleges, well, I just said that. Universities, however, introduced graduate education, professional programs, and research opportunities. Cornell University pioneered this movement, promoting broad access to various fields and combining private funding with public support. Harvard started introducing elective courses. Johns Hopkins University was the first major American university solely dedicated to research. Professors began to move away from student discipline and supervision and focus on the pursuit of knowledge, much like our current universities. American universities blended research specialization from Europe and liberal arts education from America. Next. Now we'll move into discussing the two leading educational figures of this area, the first being William Torrey Harris, who served as the superintendent of St. Louis schools from 1868 to 1880, and he later served as the U.S. Commissioner of Education. He was influenced by the philosopher Hegel, and he believed society developed through industrial progress and modernization. He favored schools that created order, discipline, and responsibility. He viewed schools similar to organized industrial systems, believing schools needed to prepare students for society. He supported traditional academic subjects and existing curriculum. He also supported kindergarten because of its ability to promote social order among the youth. Next. The second prominent figure of this era was Francis W. Parker, who was a teacher and a Civil War veteran. He was interested in European educational reform and studied the ideas of Pestalozzi and Froebel. He became the superintendent of Quincy schools in Massachusetts. Contrary to Harris, he rejected traditional methods like memorization and recitation. He promoted learning through student curiosity, real-world experience, and exploration. He used children's own oral language instead of alphabet drills. He used objects and experiences to improve math skills, and he encouraged field studies and observation. He became very successful in Quincy because of his leadership with a small system. However, he did fail to make the same changes in Boston due to the larger bureaucracy and less personal influence that he had. His approach was very student-centered. He connected learning to the student's community. He integrated subjects with one another and reduced textbook dependency. And he believed that children's natural interests and experiences should guide learning. Next.
So during the early 1900s, researchers found that immigrant students experienced different levels of academic success depending on both their ethnic background and their socioeconomic status. So some examples are students from northern or immigrants from northern and western European countries generally performed about the same as white students that were already born in America. Um, but then Jewish students were usually like exceeded the performance of the other groups. And then in contrast, there were Italian and Slavic students, and they typically struggled more. And historians discovered that these differences they were less noticeable in elementary schools, but they became a lot bigger deal during high school, where their social class played a big part in determining their educational opportunities. So, poverty often meant the students had less exposure to things like books, school expectations, just general middle class culture. Um, and yeah, so researchers also found that a family's social standing in its original home country affected how well they did in American schools. Um, So, progressive reformers believed that public schools should transform immigrant children into loyal American citizens by teaching them things like English, patriotism, and American customs. And while many American immigrants were encouraged to assimilate, um, non-European groups often face the discrimination through both immigration laws and education. So, there was a thing called the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s um, that reduced Asian immigration, and Asian students would experience inconsistent policies depending on where they were in America. So some of them were considered white and would be in the white only schools, and then in other places they weren't considered white and they would be in other schools and segregated. Like their segregation patterns were different, it was inconsistent. Um, and Mexican American students, they were legally classified as white after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but were still placed in separate underfunded schools. So they were legally white, but they weren't. That was also strange. Um, they were punished for speaking Spanish. They were given vocational curricula to prepare the boys for farm labor and the girls for domestic work. Um, so a lot of Mexican American communities, they would make their own private schools to preserve their language and culture, their identity, and provide educational opportunities outside of what was being offered. So one of this quote by this historian, Zoe Burkholder, I thought was interesting. It kind of added to this. The color line in public education, while formidable, was also contradictory, ambiguous, illogical. It changed over time. So obviously, segregation was a big problem, but it was kind of in different places. Like her quote says, it kept changing. It was illogical. Blah blah blah. So moving on to the Native American education, because as the only non-immigrants of the American continent, their experience was obviously different. Um, so we're still in the 1900s, and the boarding schools finally started changing. Native American education during this progressive era is still focused on assimilation, but reformers began questioning the effectiveness of their boarding school policies. because for decades they'd been removed from their families, sent to boarding schools, expected to abandon their languages, traditions, or cultural identities, right? But the government finally admitted that this it had produced disappointing results despite how much money they'd been putting into this. So over the 33 years or the first 33 years, they realized, okay, we've spent $240 million so far to move Native Americans from dependency to self-reliant citizenship. So their efforts in assimilating them, which was not working. So they finally started realizing some new things. They argued that separating children from their families damaged students and the tribal communities. Um, this quote from Francis Ellington Loop, he said, it's kind of a big quote, but it pretty much sums up what they were thinking during this time. It is a great mistake to start on the little ones in the path of civilization by snapping all ties of affection between them and their parents and teaching them to despise the aged and non-progressive members of their families. The sensible as well as the humane plan is to nourish their love of father and mother and home and then utilize this affection as a means of reaching through them the hearts of the elders. So good that they're understanding that part, but still not, innocent. They're still trying to assimilate them. That's their goal. But at least they're understanding that part. So that the boarding schools finally started becoming less inhumane and less severe. They started appreciating their culture, meaning they're like us just completely erasing everything about them is not working. So we're going to start doing this differently. Anyways, on to Stanley Hall and child development. This was a little part of how why the boarding school started changing the child development stuff he was talking about. But so this guy is a psychologist. So he helped reshape educational thinking by arguing that children developed through stages that were predictable, and the school should adapt to those stages. He believed that that schools and educators placed too much emphasis on academics and expected children to mature too quickly. So Hall argued they learn best through play and exploration, physical activity, actual meaningful experiences um, that matched their needs. So he encouraged teachers to recognize their backgrounds and their natural abilities instead of forcing them all through the same process. And like, so he talked about not erasing where they came from and who their families are, but still wanting them to be American enough, civilized enough. Like his first stage was savage. So there was a lot of like racial hierarchy involved in his thinking. Um, and like young children, the reason they're the way kids are is that's part of their savage stage and development. Anyways, so he had some good stuff, he had some weird stuff, but we'll move on to Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. So, still in the early 1900s, um, progressive reformers believed that education extended beyond the classroom, that they needed to be taught citizenship and character and responsibility. So, the Boy Scouts was born. They emphasized patriotism, obedience, leadership, outdoor survival, service to others, and preparing boys to be citizens as when they grew up. Um, the organization became especially popular among urban immigrant and minority youth because reformers believed it would help Americanize them. So again, it's the whole, oh, kids need to learn through play and like learn helpful skills, but also they need to be turned into this idea of what an American citizen should be. The Girl Scouts were similar, but very focused on gender roles and domestic skills. Like The girls were doing cooking and sewing and household management. So still very segregated um, in gender roles and stuff. Um, yeah, and then similar to that, 4-H movement was happening too. This developed as educators searched for ways to modernize rural America through education. There's another way of civilizing the world. School leaders organized agricultural clubs and taught children things like modern farming methods, developed by land grant colleges. Oh, what does that say? Running out of time? How much time? We have 10 minutes left? Oh my gosh.
We can
Maybe we'll
always do two parts.
okay. So if it cuts out, we'll just do it again. Okay, that's fine. Um, where was I? Okay, believing the young people would be more willing than adults to adopt these new techniques. So it's their educational plan. The clubs focused on crops and livestock and homemaking skills. If you didn't know, wait, am I blocking? Yeah. If you didn't know, the four H's on their logo means head, heart, hands, and health. And the Smith-Lever Act of 1914 that provided federal support and expanded 4-H. So it did really well. They wanted to fund it, make it more accessible. Um, it, although the movement promoted educational opportunity, and agricultural process, many clubs is still very racially segregated, and the whole male and female roles. Um, John Dewey. Okay. John Dewey became one of the most influential educational philosophers of this progressive era. He was combining the ideas from philosophy and psychology, and he believed that students learned best through active participation and meaningful experiences. Kind of like some of our other people we've been talking about. Dewey argued that schools should reflect real life and encourage students to solve problems, work together, um, connect classroom learning to everyday experiences, blah, blah, blah. So he did not believe that traditional subjects should disappear, but that teachers should recognize or reorganize them, to better meet the needs of children in society. So he viewed schools as democratic communities, and kids should learn cooperation and communication. Kind of just said that. Um, he believed education was um, one of society's strongest tools for democratic reform. Um, Although many educators embraced his child centered philosophy, critics would argue it placed too much emphasis on students' interests and not enough on traditional academic knowledge. Another person we want to talk about is Ella Flagg Young. She was one of the most influential female educators of this era and played a big role in shaping John Dewey's educational philosophy. So, after decades of experience as a teacher, a principal, a superintendent, she believed schools functioned best when teachers were respected as professionals and allowed to make decisions. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. She supported inquiry based and student centered instruction, and she strongly opposed the growing bureaucratic school systems that reduced teachers to following administrative rules. So she was very pro teacher and supporting them. Um, she argued that centralized management limited the teachers' creativity and which harms the education. She became an important advocate for female teachers, especially supporting and fighting for equal pay and pensions and improved working conditions at a time when women made up most of the teaching profession but received lower salaries than the men. A lot of her goals were not achieved during her lifetime, but her work laid a huge foundation for future improvements, um, and just professionalism and labor rights. Okay, we'll pause it here and start a new video because we have 5 minutes left. Okay. Okay, so the progressive era legacy, that is basically the whole timestamp that we've been talking about. So it permanently transformed American education. It created larger, more centralized, more bureaucratic school systems, and school administrators um, gained increasing authority over curriculum and teachers and how the school operated. And classroom teachers lost a lot of their professional independence. The textbook this week or this module described this transformation as the development of the one best system, a standardized model of public education that emphasized things like efficiency, organization, and uniformity. So, progressive reformers believed that education was essential for promoting national progress and economic growth and responsible citizenship, making schools one of the primary tools for shaping American society. Many of our educational debates that we still talk about today, like standardize standardization. Did I say that right? Why does it sound weird? Standardization. Okay, I'm going to restart that sentence. Many of the educational debates that we still talk about today, like standardization and teacher autonomy, um, ec educational equality, local versus federal control, the purpose of public education, all of those things that we still talk about today can be traced back to this progressive era. So I'm going to turn it over to Manji.
Yeah. So now looking back at 1865 to 1915, several important themes stand out. Compulsory education expanded access to schooling and made education a public responsibility rather than privilege for only some children. The growth of high schools created new pathway for learning and social mobility. At the same time, school became more standardized through one best system, which improved organization but often failed to recognize students' individual needs. Educational leaders introduced different philosophies about teaching and learning, many of which continue to influence classroom today. Overall, the years between 1865 and 1915 laid to the foundation for the modern American education system. Next. Yeah. So as I reflected on these time period, I was struck by how many educational debates still exist today. Question about government involvement, education equity, and standardized system continue continue to shape school. While reforms increase access to education, not all students benefited equally. Immigrants, Native Americans, and African American students often face significant barriers. This period reminds us that educational progress is not just about expanding school, it is also about ensuring meaningful opportunities for every student. Understanding these historical successes and challenges help us become more thoughtful educator and decision maker. Next. My student teaching experience helped me connect these historical ideas to real classrooms. I learned that students have different strengths, learning style, and background. Some learn best through hands on activities, while others need visual support or small group instructions. These reinforce the idea that education should be flexible and responsive to students' need. As a future elementary teacher, I hope to create a classroom that is inclusive, engaging, and supportive for every learner. Understanding educational history helped me better understand my role in creating those opportunities. Next. To conclude our presentation, we would like to leave you with few questions to consider. Many of the issues educators debated over 100 years ago continue to influence schools today. As a future educator, policymaker, and community members, we must continue to think critically about how to provide equitable, effective, and meaningful education experience for all students. Next. Thank you for listening our presentation. We hope this discussion has highlighted the lasting impact of educational reforms between 1865 and 1915 and encourage reflection on how these historical developments continue to influence education today. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you.